Thank you very much, John. I'm just delighted to be here tonight to talk to you about transforming the college experience for low-income, high-achieving students. And I'm looking forward to the question period. I just know that you all have a lot of good questions, so I'm excited about that. I don't think I need this, right? Because I might. Okay, terrific. So I'm going to get started, and we're going to just dive right into the data and talk about what we know now about low-income, high-achieving students. I'll start out by saying what's at stake. And then we're going to talk about the nature of the problem for low-income, high achievers in the United States. And then, and this is a good, unusual thing for an economist, we're going to talk about solutions. And it turns out the solutions actually are at hand. Okay, so what's at stake? Essentially, if a student has come from a very low-income background, a disadvantaged background, but overcomes all of the challenges that are associated with that to be a high achiever at the end of high school, we would like it to be the case that that student has the opportunity to do the most with his or her preparation for college and for life and for careers. And that's really the essence of meritocracy in the United States. We want everyone to have an equal opportunity to develop to his or her full potential, and the students who have earned the right to do that, we would like them to do that. I think that's just an important feature of a society that's just or ethical. But also it's good for economic growth. You don't have to think about it as a matter of justice or ethics. You can say, look, otherwise we're leaving people who are high aptitude, who are hard workers, who've made the effort, we're just leaving them on the table if they do not end up taking full advantage of their college-going opportunities. And meritocracy, I should point out, is not the same as income mobility, which is what people talk about a lot. There are a lot of reasons why you could have income mobility. If we ran a lottery and I gave everyone lottery tickets every year, that would create a lot of income mobility. That's not the same thing as meritocracy. I think when people talk about opportunity, what they're talking about is meritocracy, that people who work hard and have high aptitude should get outcomes that reflect that. In addition, it's important for incentives. If I'm a child growing up and I see that I'm a low-income child growing up and I see that the other low-income children who manage to do very well in school don't end up having college outcomes and careers that are better than the students who goofed off in high school and never worked very hard, I don't have very much incentive myself to be an achiever. So it's important that low-income, high achievers actually do have good college-going opportunities. And finally, they are the obvious role models to disadvantaged communities. They are the obvious people to be evangelists, to say to other children from disadvantaged backgrounds, I made it into the middle class or the upper middle class. You can do the same thing too with hard work. So that's what's at stake, and I think that's important. Who are the low-income, high achievers who we're going to be talking about tonight? Well, we're going to be talking about very high-achieving students, and there's a reason for that, and I'll come back to it at the end of the talk. But right now, let me just tell you who we're going to be talking about. Family incomes in the bottom quarter of the family income distribution, it's about $40,000. They have to be scoring in the top 10% on either the ACT or the SAT. Those are the two college assessments. And if you're in the top 10%, I should mention that only about 40% of students take those tests in the United States. So it's about the top 4% of high school students, top 4 or 5% of high school students in the United States. And they have to have an A- or above as their high school GPA. Now, this group of students, people up until the time we did this research, thought that there were about 4,000 of them. Okay, 4,000 low-income, high-achieving students. And what a co-author, Chris Avery, and I did was we looked at the data on every single one of the students in the high school class of 2008 who should have graduated from college in 2012 if they had graduated on time. So we have every single one of them who took a college assessment, and we are able to follow every single one of them through college. So I like to tell people when they say, well, I don't know if I believe your evidence, I know a student who doesn't fit this profile, I always say, well, you just have an anecdote, I have everyone. So, all right, so what we did was we thought that there were about 4,000 of them, And when we actually looked at the data, we found there were 35,000 of them, okay? About 8 times as many as people had thought that there were. Now, why was it that people thought that there were so few when there were actually so many more high achievers among the low-income population? Well, because they were not on anyone's radar screen, and they were not on anyone's radar screen because they didn't apply to selective colleges and universities. And if you don't apply, then no one knows you're there, right? It's not as though there's a great spy network that just knows where all of the low-income high achievers are. So the first thing is, it's good news that there are a lot more low-income high achievers than we thought there were, but it's not good news that a lot of them appear not to understand their college-going opportunities. So let's take a quick look at what high-income students do who have the same level of achievement. Okay? So exactly the same level of achievement, but they're from the top quarter of the income distribution. What this chart is showing you is the sort of schools that they apply to. So if you apply in the region that's pale green, that's what we call a peer institution. It's where your scores basically match the scores of the other students who go to the same school. So it's peer to remind you that the other students there are a lot like you. Reach, you may have heard of that. That's you're applying to a school where the students are a little better than you are by a few percentiles. Safety, you're very likely to get in because the other students are just a little worse than you in terms of your grades and test scores. And then non-selective, those are community colleges, four-year institutions that don't require any test scores or grade point average, just a high school diploma or a GED, an equivalence to that. So high-income students do something that college guidance counselors recommend. They apply mostly to safety, peer, and reach schools, and they tend to attend peer institutions most of the time, and a few of them apply to non-selective schools like culinary schools and art schools and so forth. Okay? But they basically follow college guidance counselors' advice. If you look at low-income students, exactly the same level of achievement, okay, but they're from the other end of the income distribution, the first thing you notice is the vast majority of them are going to non-selective institutions where they are scoring often 80 percentiles, 60 percentiles above the other students on the college assessments. Okay, so they are just not going to the institutions, not applying to the institutions where the other students are prepared like them. You can see there are a few low-income high achievers who do apply to safety, peer, or reach schools, and so about 1 in 8 of them actually end up at one of these sort of peer institutions. But the vast majority of them end up going to non-selective institutions because that's the only place where they apply. So we looked at the data and we said, this is really striking. It's very, very striking that these low-income students don't seem to be taking full advantage of the rich array of college-going opportunities in the United States. And it does matter which college you go to. I probably don't need to convince any of you of that. But the difference between going to a non-selective institution and the colleges that are peer colleges for this group of students, which would include a place like Stanford or University of Chicago or Vanderbilt or Yale or Harvard or Pomona, Williams, all kinds of places like that, it's a very big difference in terms of lifetime outcomes. Okay? So we should care about knowing why it is that they are not applying to these institutions. And that's what we investigated in our first body of research. So here are the explanations we considered, and I'm going to sort of knock them off one at a time so that we get down to what are the likely explanations. The first one was just maybe selective colleges cost too much and low-income students don't go there because it's prohibitive. Just the money doesn't work. It could be that if they apply to these selective colleges, they're not going to be admitted anyway, or if they are admitted, they're not going to do very well if they go to a peer institution. So it makes sense for them to stay at the non-selective colleges. It could be that the colleges are just not doing a good job of recruiting these students. They don't really want them to come and they're not trying. Or it could be that the high school counselors of these low-income students are just completely incompetent and not giving them any guidance about their college-going opportunities. It could be that low-income students just don't want to go to peer institutions. We hear this a lot. The idea that they feel they wouldn't fit in, or that mom and dad don't want them to go away to college, things like that. That would be a sort of cultural reason. And then finally, students just need better information. So we're going to try to look at those explanations, and I'm going to go through them fairly quickly. So let's talk about whether selective colleges are cost prohibitive for low-income students. Well, it turns out that the opposite is true. Absolutely the opposite. So what I have here is college selectivity from most competitive. Those are the schools that I just mentioned a few minutes ago, all the way down. These are what are called the Barron's rankings of colleges in the United States, to the non-selective colleges, which are at the bottom. And you will see that for a low-income student, the most competitive colleges cost, and I've drawn a green line so that you can see how much that costs, the most competitive schools cost less even than two-year public community colleges. They could go to the most resource-rich schools in the United States for less money than it would cost them to go to the institutions that they are currently mainly attending. Okay? It's a little unintuitive that for this group of students, as they go to more and more selective colleges, it costs them less. Now, this doesn't happen very often in life. If it did, we would all go down to the car dealership and say, no, no, don't show me the Chevrolet. I would only like to see the Lamborghinis because they're so much cheaper, right? But for this group of students, it costs them less to go to Yale than it would cost them to go to their local community college. And that's because the most competitive colleges have a lot of resources, and they're willing to put a lot of resources into giving financial aid, not just for tuition and fees, but also for living expenses to low-income high achievers. Okay, so that is not the right explanation. It is not the costs. For high-income students, yes, as you go to a more competitive college, it costs you more, but for low-income students, the opposite is true. Okay, so we crossed that one off the list. The next one is maybe they just don't do very well when they go to a peer college, a selective college. Well, we're able to see that because, as I said, we got to trace every one of them through their college-going experience. And we found that low-income high achievers were just as likely to do well, to graduate on time, and to thrive at selective colleges as their counterparts who were from high-income families, once we compare people who really have the same incoming test scores and grades. And in fact, a kind of shocking thing is that if I take a low-income high achiever and I send that student to a peer institution, he has a probability of graduating on time of well over 90% for all of these very competitive colleges that he could get into. If he goes to a community college, he has less than a 50% probability of graduating on time. And that's despite the fact that he is head and shoulders above the other students in terms of preparation. So that was a surprise to us, but it is not the case that these students don't get in, or that if they get into the very selective institutions, they don't seem to thrive there. So that explanation will also knock off the list. Now, the next ones are sort of who's to blame? Is someone to blame that these students aren't applying? Since that seems to be where the problem lies, that they don't apply. And the message that we came away with when we did the research was that the students who we like to call the missing students, the students who are out there but don't bother to apply to any of the peer institutions, are students who are at high schools where they are relatively scarce. And the students who are low-income high achievers who do apply to peer institutions are a very specific group of students. They are students who attend selective high schools in the United States, who attend magnet high schools, who attend a few public high schools that for reasons are traditionally feed these selective colleges and universities. They're students who live in the vicinity of a very selective college and some of the biggest cities in the United States. And we call those students achievement typical because even though they're low income, their behavior looks very much like those of other students with the same level of achievement. And in fact, as I'll show you in a moment, it's not just that they come from the biggest cities. They come from the very biggest cities, and they come from specific schools in the biggest cities. And the remaining students, sort of 8 out of 9 of them, are relatively dispersed. We call those students the income typical students because they act as though they were low achievers, low income students, even though they're really high achieving students. Okay? So let's have a look at a map of the United States. This is what's called a choropleth map. It's like a heat map. Okay, so when some place is darker, that means there's more of something, and when it's lighter, there's less of something. And what we're looking at here is the number of low-income high achievers per 17-year-old in the population. And they're basically just everywhere, okay? They're all over the place. Low-income high achievers are all over the place. But the low-income high achievers who apply to peer institutions are not all over the place. They're in just a few places. And in fact, 70% of them come from only 15 metropolitan areas. There are 316 metropolitan areas in the United States. 70% of them come from the ones that are listed up here, places like our own San Francisco and Oakland, Los Angeles, Boston, Providence, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore. And furthermore, they don't just come from those cities, they come from specific schools within those cities. Stuyvesant, which is an exam school in New York, it's a selective high school in New York, is responsible for sending 360 low-income high achievers a year to selective colleges and universities. Not a single one is missed from Stuyvesant. In fact, for the New York City exam schools, those are the selective public schools in New York City, not a single low-income high achiever is ever missed. Okay? Or for instance, in San Francisco, the Lowell School, which may be familiar to you, it's a public selective school, none of those students get missed. Okay? So from some schools, every single one of their low-income high achievers goes, and we're missing all of the others who do not come out of a very small set of schools or who don't happen to live right next to a university. You know, I always like to give Columbia as an example. Columbia gives itself a lot of credit for finding low-income high achievers. But if you haven't ever been to Columbia, or if you have, you'll have noticed that it sits right on top of Harlem and the South Bronx. So it's basically giving itself a lot of credit for finding the students who don't even have to get off the subway to go to Columbia. Okay, so what's the point of all of this? Let's do a couple of thought experiments about why this matters. Let's say that colleges work very hard, okay, and send an admissions staff person to any high school in the United States with 20 or more high-achieving students. If you are a top-income quartile student and you're a high achiever, you have a 92% chance of being recruited by one of these selective colleges and universities. If you are one of these achievement typicals, one of these students who attends a sort of a feeder high school, you have a 66% chance of meeting a college admissions recruiter. But only 17% of the other low-income high achievers have any chance of meeting a college admissions recruiter. And this would be colleges working incredibly hard. Okay, they cannot possibly do this. There are almost 40,000 high schools in the United States, so this isn't even in the realm of possibility. And even if it were, they couldn't reach all of these low-income high achievers. What about counselors? Is it that high school counselors are somehow wildly incompetent? So here's another little thought experiment. Suppose that a counselor would develop expertise in sending low-income high achievers to peer institutions if he or she had attended such an institution themselves, or if they had 5% of their student load. So a typical high school counselor in the United States attends to about 400 students. Okay, so 5% of their student load were high achievers. Basically, all of the high-income high achievers would end up having a counselor who knew something about college-going opportunities, and not a single one of the income typicals would. Literally not a single one. That's partly because college counselors in the United States don't go to peer institutions themselves, but it's also just not the case that the income typicals would get picked up. So it's not the case that somehow selective colleges are terribly to blame or high school counselors are to blame. It's got to be one of the two remaining explanations. Either it's a cultural reason, they just don't want to go to peer institutions, they don't care about the fact that they're giving up a lot of resources and different life outcomes, or maybe the students just need better information. And that's what we decided we were going to be interested in testing. So at this point, let's just summarize a bit. There are many more low-income high achievers than anyone ever thought. Cost per se is really not the reason that they're not taking advantage of college opportunities. They thrive at these institutions that are rich in resources when they go there, so that doesn't look like the explanation for why they're not going. All of their divergence from the behavior of high-income students with the same level of achievement happens at the application stage. It really does not happen when they're in college. And it doesn't make sense to blame the colleges or the counselors. And any solution that we come up with is going to have to deal with the fact that they are quite dispersed. So solutions that sound like I will form a club for low-income high achievers and they'll all come to my club after school, they're just not going to work because your club is going to be very small. It will have about 2 people in it. Okay? This led us to a research project which we called Expanding College Opportunities because my co-author, Sarah Turner, and I thought, well, if we understand the problem, maybe we can come up with a solution. And we felt we understood the problem pretty well. Expanding College Opportunities is an intervention that was designed to give students highly customized information about their college-going opportunities. It doesn't tell them where to go to college, something that I think would be not very ethical, but it does try to help them understand their college-going opportunities. And I'll give you a bit of detail about it. So this is our logo, and students would get a big folder that would arrive in the mail in a special Tyvek envelope with lots of parts to the brochures and things like that. We sent these materials to 40,000 high achievers in the United States, most of whom were from the bottom third of the family income distribution. Now, right away, the fact that we sent them to 40,000 students should tell you that we chose a method of targeting the students that did not depend on Sarah and I calling them all personally. Right? So, because that wasn't going to happen, we wanted to choose a method of intervening with them, of giving them information that could be done at arm's length, because we knew that they were dispersed and that if we wanted to round them all up and talk to them in person, it was going to be very difficult to do. The materials are customized to a student, and this is something that I'll talk about a little bit more. What you want to think about is that we didn't want to give all these students generic information about college-going opportunities. There's a lot of generic information out there. And there are a lot of college brochures out there. What we wanted to do was give them information that we knew would be relevant to them, to their situation, to the colleges that they were likely to be comparing. And so if we knew that the students from a certain high school traditionally went to a certain college, we would make sure that that was one of the colleges in the comparison group. We would also make sure, for instance, if they were from Iowa, that they always saw the University of Iowa as one of the comparisons, or Iowa State. Those are the public flagships within Iowa. They would also always see the most selective private university in their state, Grinnell. It turns out that's in Iowa. And then they would see some out-of-state colleges that were peer institutions for them. So they were very customized materials, and I'll talk a little bit more about the customization later. But we knew a student where a student went to high school, a student's locality, and we knew their family income essentially. We gave them application guidance, which was more or less what a very good college guidance counselor would give, again, customized to the student. We gave them information about net costs. Now, that's a little bit like that chart I showed you before. And I like to think of this, in fact, now people call this the slap sheet. I didn't come up with that terminology. But the idea was to give the students a bit of a slap in the face that said, you may think that Princeton would cost you so much you couldn't possibly go there, but it will cost you $0. And you may think that your local non-selective college is the least expensive option, but actually it's more expensive. And the idea was not to tell them exactly what a college would cost them, but to wake them up. That their families might be sadly misestimating the cost of going to college. We also gave them no paperwork application fee waivers. So right now, all of these students qualify for fee waivers for applying to college anyway. So they shouldn't have to pay $100 or something like that to apply to college because they're low income. So they don't have to pay. But they do have to do some paperwork. We just sent them fee waivers because we knew they were low income. And all of this cost about $6 per student, including the reminders. And basically, that was just for mailing costs. And we tried doing it all over the internet first, and that did not succeed at all for reasons I can tell you about later. But so $6 per student was the marginal cost, or the variable cost in economics terms. I'm not including in that all the work that Sarah and I put into this and that our staff put into coming up with the data behind this. So how did we do all of this? Well, we spent over a decade developing methods to estimate family income. And I won't tell you how we did it because part of it's too secret now. Also, we assembled an achievement and college-going history for every high school in the United States so that we actually knew where the students from each high school were likely to consider going to college. We customized the materials by using a very big database that had all of this information for different colleges so that we could give students very customized information that was relevant to their family income and their area. And we could give them information about the fact that maybe one institution that they were considering had a graduation rate of 90% and another had a graduation rate of 10%. Those are both graduation rates that really do appear in US colleges data all the time. And we ensured that a student always saw their local institutions in a state context and a national context. Okay. The Expanding College Opportunity Studies has been covered a lot in the media and often is mildly misrepresented. I don't think journalists mean to do that, but there are just some misunderstandings that I want to make sure are not out there. We did not recommend colleges to people. I really don't believe in doing that. What we wanted to do was help students understand how to make choices for themselves by ensuring that the information was relevant and not just flat, massive information. And I like to think of this as being a lot like what Amazon, I hope you all go to Amazon. I do all the time. I live through Amazon. Anyway, when we go to Amazon, imagine if we went to Amazon and it was just like a big phone directory. It's just a long list of all the things that they sold with the prices at the side. None of us would buy very much stuff from Amazon because it would be such a nuisance to try and find things. Okay? That's flat information. It would still be there, but it would just be a pain to find things. When we go to Amazon, we put in a search, and Amazon very cleverly gives us back customized information that's relevant to what we were searching for and helps us find things fast. And that's why we end up buying things from them. Well, that was our idea here, was that we would build this huge database that would be like the back office that Amazon uses to help you find something and make your search experience user-friendly and easy instead of just having a whole bunch of information that's out there like a telephone book. Okay, so there's no standard set of materials. So even though they're very cheap because when you search on Amazon, it's very cheap for them to allow you to do an extra search, but that doesn't mean it was cheap for them to kind of figure out how to do all that stuff. And the interventions are very user-friendly, but they're not really simple. They're a combination of big data and back office analytics that are quite difficult, combined with something that, from the student's point of view, looks really simple. Okay? So this gives you an example of a graduation rate handout. As I said, graduation rates differ a lot. I don't think you can read the data for New Hampshire, but for instance, if you were a student from New Hampshire, you would have gotten this graduation rate handout. And it says Dartmouth College has an on-time graduation rate of 86%, but the University of New Hampshire at Manchester has a graduation rate of 20%. Okay, so trying to help students understand those sorts of differences. This is an example of a fee waiver. They were for specific students. You couldn't give them to your friends. And we had about 200 colleges and universities in the United States that would accept our fee waivers. This is an example of a college organization chart. If a student would tell us what colleges they were interested in, we would give them a big refrigerator chart with all of the deadlines, all of the things they needed to do, and so forth. And then we would send them reminders. I mean, obviously, it's really a computer sending them reminders saying, do you remember that you need to take 2 more SA2 subject exams in order to apply to Harvard University, and the deadline for registering is next week. Okay? So it's kind of like your mom and dad, only computerized. And we had all of these follow-up materials. I've mentioned some of them to you. Reminders to apply to multiple schools, to complete the free application for federal student aid, things like that. It's a randomized control trial. We gave some of the students no information, and we gave some of the students all these things I've been talking about, so it's very easy to do an evaluation. And we know how students fare because we surveyed them, and we also use an administrative data source that follows all students through college in the United States. It's called the National Student Clearinghouse. Well, what were the effects? Students submitted 48% more applications relative to the control group who didn't get anything. Their probability of applying to a peer college, that's one of the most selective colleges in the United States, went up by 56% relative to the control group, and their probability of admission to a peer college went up by 78%. But they didn't just apply to these colleges, they also enrolled in them. So for instance, their probability of enrolling in a peer college went up by about 46%. And they went to colleges that had instructional spending that was 22% higher, graduation rates that were 15% higher relative to the control group. And we did all of this for $6. You might worry that they would have gone to these more selective colleges and universities and not done very well. Well, they're not very far in, so I can't say a lot about them. But at least in their freshman year, they're earning the same or better grades than the students who are in the control group students who are attending largely non-selective schools. And they are persisting at a higher rate than the students who are in the control group. On a cost-benefit basis, for a $10 worth of cost, okay, they're about 51% more likely to apply to a peer college. They're going to places where instructional spending is about $6,000 higher. It's all for $10, so we didn't end up spending that much. Interestingly enough, my co-author, Chris Avery, has also done an in-person intervention with exactly the same type of students. It's not a coincidence. We're co-authors, so that's the explanation. And he used expert counselors. And for $10 worth of cost, the effects were all statistically insignificant, but it caused students to apply to 0.006 more colleges. And so we were actually more effective than in-person counseling, which we thought could not possibly happen. So this was a huge surprise to us. So our cost-benefit ratio is obviously much higher than his. Okay. And the potential long-run benefits are lifetime earnings benefits that are direct, that affect the students themselves, of at least $500,000 if you do reasonable calculations. And of course, those are just the direct benefits, right? There are also spillovers potentially to other students. There are changes in communities. There are all kinds of things that could occur as a result of these students having their lives transformed by going to colleges and universities that have rich resources. So what are the takeaways overall? The first is that low-income students really can be high achievers. We should not have an outlook that says low-income students are doomed to being low achievers. I think that's an important thing to get across. Quite a number of the journalists to whom I've spoken have said, this is so sad to hear about this. It's so sad to hear that there are 31,000 low-income high achievers who don't seem to understand their college-going opportunities. And I said, that's like saying it's sad that you discovered, you know, a crock of gold buried under a tree or something like that. Well, it's sad that you have to get a shovel, but it's better than not having the crock of gold underneath a tree, right? So I don't think it's sad. I think it's exciting that some students make it through very disadvantaged circumstances to become high achievers. I believe we could potentially improve our meritocracy a lot by overcoming what are surmountable barriers. I'm not talking about changing these students' lives completely. I'm talking about making sure that they have good information for going to college. The Expanding College Opportunities project was so successful, and since it was designed to be cheap and easy to do, apart from the back office stuff, which we still do, the College Board and ACT are now implementing these types of interventions nationwide for every single low-income high achiever in the United States, and they're doing it at their own expense. So I think for us, we couldn't have done better than that. And the direct benefits are about $16 billion per cohort, and we think there are probably some indirect benefits as well. We're not stopping here. We are going forward, and this is what I would be glad to talk about, especially in the question period. We're really gearing up to try to use the same ideas, smart use of big data and analytics, to address other problems in higher education that can potentially be addressed by information. For instance, the fact that many people worry that the costs of higher education are now disproportionate to the value added. So that's something we can have information about in the future. We all hear a lot about the loan default problems. Students who go to college, they take out a lot of loans, and then they find it very difficult to pay them back. Low completion rates. And we're going to be doing these types of interventions not just for the high achievers, but for students with any level of college readiness. And we're so excited about the possibilities for doing more for college going students in the United States, especially low-income students, but really all college-going students by using the kind of smart analytics that you get in a place like the Valley, and of course the big data. So I'll stop right there and be glad to take questions.
Well, I don't think Caroline really needs my help. I'm here for decoration. But if you want, I can call on people, but you can call on people too.
Okay.
I was really fascinated by the difference between the ineffectiveness of the in-person. Do you have any other comments and color to that as to why that would be?
Well, because I know the person who conducted those interventions very well, Chris Avery, old friend of mine, often frequent co-author, he had really good expert college guidance counselors doing the interventions for him. In fact, he was able to do them much more cheaply than a normal person would by doing a bit of arm twisting with people whom he had worked with for numerous years. My guess is that we thought the in-person interventions would be a lot more effective. Okay, so I have the same intuition as everyone else. My guess is that there's something about having the written materials around the family dinner table that makes the difference. And one of the things that we found was we did a pilot year, and we found in the pilot year that the families did not like internet-only materials. They liked the written materials. Mom and dad especially liked the written materials, and they did not consider internet-only materials to be very credible. And I also think the family did not have a conversation about things that were just online. So there was something about getting the written materials and having those conversations. We often found, in fact, we tried doing interventions with just the students and tried doing them with just parents and so forth. We found you really couldn't do that. It's a family decision. So if we sent them to the parents, the students would read them, and if we sent them to the students, the parents would read them, and there wasn't any point in trying to direct them to people. The other thing is that maybe when the student talks to the college counselor, they come home with some version of the information, which may or may not be very accurate by the time mom and dad don't have a credible source of information. One of the things we learned about low-income families in this process was that they are quite suspicious of information, especially that comes over the internet, but they're just generally suspicious of information about colleges. And one of the things they're most suspicious about is that colleges will really give their children this financial aid and won't somehow draw them in and then get them into a lot of debt and cause all kinds of problems. So they were suspicious about that. They're suspicious of colleges recruiting their children, and they are suspicious of online for-profit firms that offer to give their children college guidance counseling and then start charging their children money. Now, when they first said they were suspicious, I thought, oh, people don't really do that. And so Sarah and I went online and pretended to be low-income high achievers and quickly found that, in fact, we got all kinds of for-profit firms they would sort of suck you in, and then they'd start charging you $65 for often very inaccurate information, actually. So after that, we decided their suspicions were relatively well-founded. I'll just tell you a funny story. The first year, we found that one way that the parents, and sometimes the students, but usually it was a parent, who was suspicious, would allay their suspicions was by calling us up. So they would find our names someplace. We didn't make them prominent in the first year, in the pilot year. And I would get calls at my office, and I would say, this is Professor Caroline Hoxby, because Stanford telephone numbers ring right through to our office. And the parent would say, oh, very good, goodbye. You exist. That was it. That was it. So after getting thousands of these calls, I decided it now rings straight through to my secretary. So if you call me, you will never get me back for this reason. Mm-hmm.
So did you think about how zip codes played into your $41,000 number? Because I live in Palo Alto, but I spent a lot of time in Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. Now, I can tell you $41,000 goes a lot further there than it does in Palo Alto.
Sure it does.
So did you think about where you would draw the line based on zip code, and maybe that number would be higher in terms of number of students, and B, how the results might have been affected by zip code?
Right, so you're absolutely right. The cost of living varies a lot in different parts of the United States. So $41,000 is something very different here than it is, say, in Mississippi or Alabama. The reason we stuck with that threshold was that federal student aid and most other financial aid programs do not take account of the cost of living of where you live. So we felt that we needed to sort of stick with the way policy actually worked in the United States, and financial aid does not take account of that. Now, maybe it should, but it doesn't at this point. we did not identify students' family incomes at a zip code level. Instead, we really spent years and years getting to the point where we could figure out what the students' family's income was. And that's a process that uses tremendously more data. And one of the things that's actually kind of interesting about what colleges had been doing before was colleges had been trying pretty hard to find low-income high achievers. I give them tremendous credit. One of the things they'd done was they'd identified all the low-income zip codes in the United States, and they would send brochures and special letters to those zip codes. Well, that actually worked quite well for New York City, because in New York City, zip codes are very small and dense. So in fact, you will find that there are zip codes where everyone is basically low income. But if you go out into the middle of Ohio, you will find that most zip codes are pretty income diverse, so you can't find low-income students that way. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why they were so good at finding the students from certain metropolitan areas and so bad at finding the students from other smaller metropolitan areas. So it works for New York City, it doesn't work for Toledo, Ohio.
Caroline, do you know whether the students who have a mother and father living at home have different behavior than those who are living in a one-parent household?
So we did look to see whether the effects of the interventions were different for students who were from two-parent families or one-parent families. We looked to see whether they were different for black students and Hispanic students, for girls and boys, and we found no differences across any of those dimensions, and that was a surprise to us. I think one of the, as I said, this was 40,000 students, so we obviously did not talk to all the families, but it is interesting how much these families want to do what's right for their children, but really struggle with having the information to do it. And I'll tell you a particularly poignant story. A mother called me up. I did speak to her for a while. Don't do that all the time, obviously, with 40,000 students. But she called me up and she was tearful because her daughter had perfect scores on either the SAT or the ACT. I couldn't remember which. And she was also a sort of math Olympiad kind of girl. She'd done very well on the American Mathematics Association tests. And when the family read these materials, they realized, oh, our daughter could probably go to Caltech or MIT or one of these places. She could probably get in. They had sort of thought she could get in, but they had just assumed it would be completely impossible. And they had pre-committed their daughter to going to a local engineering school that I had never heard of when she was in the beginning of the 11th grade or something like that. And they felt that they'd made a promise to this school. And they had done it because this school had promised them a scholarship. And they hadn't realized that now, even after the scholarship, this school would be more expensive than it would be for them to send their daughter to something like MIT. And the mother really just felt she could not go back on this promise. But she was very tearful about it. And I said, well, you know, you have to make the decision for yourself. But she was struggling to make the right decision for her daughter. I think we have a question over here. And I saw your hand.
What fraction of the people that you did an outreach to ultimately responded in one form or another, either in writing or over the net?
You mean responded to us and told us something about themselves? Or?
Just so you have acknowledgement that they opened up the package and responded in some way.
About 60% of the packages get dropped in the garbage without anyone recognizing that they even existed. So what we did was we surveyed students over the families over the telephone and figured out whether they even could recognize that they'd received the mailing. Now some of that is because they go to the wrong people. So we have their addresses at the time they took the test, and we actually then sent them the materials quite a lot after. The other is that we're not a known organization. Who is expanding college opportunities after all? Nobody knows who we are. We could just be anyone. With the College Board and ACT doing it, it's going to work much better. First of all, they're very well-known organizations. Secondly, the materials are going right out after you receive your scores. So you'll get your scores, and then about a week and a half to 2 weeks later, you'll receive the materials. And we think that that will increase the rate at which students open the packages. I mean, you've just found out, hey, I'm really high scoring on these tests. Now you get a bunch of materials from the same organization. So we think that problem is solved for them, but it was a problem for us. It really was. Here and then.
I want to ask you a question about culture, which you seem to, that's a big word, I guess, that you seem to downplay. My wife and I have been on the fringes compared to you getting involved in sort of things like that. So I guess partly what we've found is that students, sort of like you're dealing with, culturally, one, don't feel like they fit into some perhaps slightly peer group, peer college, or their family structure is such that they're going away to a school. I mean, to go from here to Harvard
Right.
would be just a major jump. And now we haven't directly dealt with that, but we've been on the fringes of that. And I've been at a high school where my son went to getting involved a teeny bit with students. And culturally, it's just like there's a disconnect between the things that you're talking about and what their attitudes seem to be.
So I think that's a great question. And I have a sort of a practical answer, and then I have a longer term answer. So I'm a sort of practical gal. So my practical answer is, well, why don't we see what we can do for all of the students for whom culture is not a problem, and they mainly need more information, and then work on the students who, in addition, the family really doesn't want them to consider going to any college except the local college. So that's my first practical answer. It's just sort of, well, let's see whether we can address this problem first, and then let's work on the harder core problem. The long-term answer, though, I think is really that at the end of the day, the person who's going to be best at convincing a family that it will be good for their child, or it will not be horrible for their child to go away to a school where other people may have higher incomes, is going to be someone who came from the same neighborhood and who succeeded in doing it themselves. So you've got to get the first stream of people to do it, and they may be the people who end up being the best ambassadors. So that's to say that if we succeed in getting a lot more students to come on the basis of just their being informed, they may be the people who actually make the difference for their communities. But you're absolutely right. I mean, we know that there are some students who feel that they could not go very far away for college because perhaps they're the one person who really speaks English well in the household, and mom and dad need that. We did not find, we expected to find, because so many people had told us we would find, that the interventions didn't work on Hispanic girls, because we'd heard that Hispanic families didn't want their daughters to go away for college, but that turned out not to be true in the data. We also didn't find this as much discomfort with the idea of going to a different college than your high school classmates as we'd expected to find. In fact, I would say the typical answer in this survey is, I don't want to go to college with my high school classmates. I was the one student who was really smart, or I was the one student who worked really hard, and they don't want to work very hard, and they're not very ambitious, and I want to go to a place with other students who are going to support me in my effort to change. So that we heard a lot of answers like that. That doesn't necessarily mean that they translated that very well into college-going opportunities. They may have thought that they were doing that by going to a college that had a 20% graduation rate. So the aspiration and the actions were often separated by quite a lot. But I think the culture question is a very good and deep one, and probably for the long term.
So I was just wondering, so especially when you said that there were so many of these high-achieving, low-income students, do people put their income levels when they take the SATs? Like, how did, then you would know immediately, like, who all the low-income people were. Like, how did you know how did you figure out what their incomes were, that there were so many low-income people among the high scorers?
That's a great question. So let me answer as much of it as I can answer right now. They are asked about their family income levels when you take either the SAT or the College Board tests. However, the vast majority of students do not answer. The ACT gets a higher percentage of them to answer, but they do it by asking the question as follows. Colleges give generous financial aid to students who are from low-income families. What is your family's income? Turns out that doesn't get very accurate answers. What we initially did to figure out what students' family incomes were was that we took each student's the information that each student did give, the College Board or the ACT, and we mapped their exact address, and then we knew the exact census block in which they lived. A census block is about 50 households. And then we did a lot of other things as well, used a lot of other data as well to get students' family incomes. Today, we no longer do that. We use a source of information that I can whisper in your ear afterwards, but I do not talk about publicly at this point for various reasons that have to do with Washington, D.C. John Gunn.
You've given us an incredible study of spotting a problem, assembling the data with the analytics and finding solution. What I'm curious about is to sort of ask you a general question. Is this, what is the level of intellectual ferment and experimentation among the academic educational establishment? And is this a lot different than it was 5 years ago? We have got online experimentations going on in one thing and another. So is this thing really accelerating, or is it no big deal?
It certainly, it is a sea change. Traditionally, the education establishment in the United States has been very against experimentation, unlike the medical establishment. So you might think in medicine, actually, experiments are, if anything, more dangerous than they are in education. After all, if I give you, if I give John one textbook and I give Mary another math textbook, there's only so much danger involved, whereas giving you heart medication or cancer medication, there's much more danger. But the medical establishment has for a long time recognized the value of experimentation, and in education it has not been recognized because people thought it was unfair to give some students different treatment than other students. And the result is that years and years, decades would go by and we would still not know the answer to questions. And so while it was true that we were never treating one student differently than another, we might be treating all of them quite badly. And I think that was the reason for us to try and have more scientific, more experimental approaches to education. There are some questions that experiments can really help you answer, and answer fairly quickly. I think this is an example of something where we could do an experiment. It involved 40,000 students. I think we know the answer. It's just not that hard to compare the treatment group and control group. And that type of education research has really taken off especially among people who come from an economics background. So the economists, I think maybe we've got thicker skins than other people, and so we were willing to be criticized and go into doing experiments. We're not the only ones doing experiments now, but we do a lot more experiments than other folks, especially the very big experiments. Now, there are some questions in education that just cannot be answered via experiments, and I think we have to realize that. They're what I think of as the macro questions, or the macroeconomic questions of education. If I say to you, let's change the entire way in which California finances its public schools, we can't answer that with an experiment. So we have to use some of both. But it's a much improved situation.
Ellen, over here, if I could.
Hello, and first of all, thank you so much for your research, for your presentation tonight, and the value that you're presenting. Earlier, Mr. Graham and I were discussing the cultural influences, and as a matter of fact, a couple of questions ago, you semi-answered what I'm going to ask you. Is the follow-through and the influence of the culture in that involvement. So have you considered asking every student who you follow and you have a relationship with to perhaps dedicate one future visit to a potential student going on to future education? Just to say, will you pay back just by going to one family? Because that cultural and personal attachment, you're already saying, is so valuable.
We could do that, certainly. we would randomly tell some people to do it and randomly not tell some other people to do it. That's the truth. We're experimenters, so we would see whether it made a difference that we asked them. I think our hope is that people will do it to some extent on their own, but we don't know that. We certainly are going to look to see what happens. If we move a student from high school X to going to a more selective college than anyone has gone to before, we're looking to see whether there's a little trail of additional students who start to go to either that school or go to other similar schools. So we are looking for that. But we haven't actually explicitly asked students to pay it forward. You have to think about that. Yes, yes, exactly.
Over here.
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to echo what the previous questioner was saying. It's just fantastic what you're doing. So, I mean, it's wonderful. I wanted to ask a question about what you learned about what characterized the responding families versus the non-responders, and within the non-responders, the people who basically didn't change their behavior. If there's anything you can say about subsegments of those that would give rise to theories about what else one could do beyond what you've already done, which is obviously fabulous.
Right. So I think where we are going with this research is precisely that we feel that we need to develop fuller information interventions that are more interactive for people so they can try out more things on their own. And we didn't do that here, but it becomes, I think the parents and the families who have difficulty are families who don't just need the information, they actually need to interact with it a bit more. And they need to be able to try out scenarios for themselves. And you can't do that very much with written materials. So that the types of interventions we're now working on are much more interactive, and families will be able to put together different scenarios for themselves, or students will be able to put together different scenarios for themselves, and they'll be able to get a lot more information as well. Once you move to an online tool, you can do a lot of things that you can't do with written materials. So we've always wanted to move in that direction, and the additional thing is that we can move away from just the high-achieving students. The thing that makes the high-achieving students special, and the reason we started with them, is that, well, first of all, there was an obvious disconnect for them. They were going to non-selective institutions, and they appeared to be very well prepared to go to the most selective institution. But also, they are the one group of students where we did not have to worry about giving them advice on the financing. And the reason is that essentially, as they chose schools that were more selective, they paid less. Now, that's not generally true. Okay, if I take just a typical college-ready student and they're choosing between a college with more resources and a college with fewer resources, they will have to pay more, usually, to go to the college with more resources. So for them, the trade-off is more complicated. And we knew that once we got to that group of students, we would have to have tools that were a lot more complex. But that's where we're going, essentially.
So every year I tell you the motto of the stand-up comedians. And the motto is that you should quit when the audience still wants more. So I'm going to follow that motto. Caroline, I want to thank you.
You're welcome, and I so much enjoyed being here.
And for those of you who are not members of SIEPR, I hope you'll get that fixed.